My long-standing interest has been to understand this world and to document it and try to transmit that understanding within my natural limits, of course. I'm not interested in groupthink. I'm not interested in tribalism. I'm not interested in national identity and ethnic identity, which is to say, I'm not interested in those things as they apply to me. I recognize that I'm a bit of an outlier, perhaps an oddity, and I say that with neither pride nor shame, but I have no feeling of kinship with people who share a similar background, that is, ethnically. I also have no kinship with people merely on the basis of politics or other things. I feel very much an individualist. Now, given that view, it seems odd that some people, and some people's perception, that I might talk to, entertain, and observe, talk about phenomena such as national movements, ethnic national movements. But that's because in recognizing that I am an oddball, an oddity, an individual who feels no kinship with groups and tribes, at the same time, I have to acknowledge that most people do engage in tribalism. Most people are tribal. The vast majority of people, in fact, are tribal. We are surrounded by tribal people, we who are individuals. So I might not care about, or for rather, I might not care for these ethnic identities, these nationalist concerns. But many people do, and it defines the way things go in the world. It can define politics. It can define the culture, and so on and so forth. So I would be remiss if I didn't document it. I would be remiss if I didn't talk about it, and if I didn't have conversations of the sort, such as one I had with the libertarian realists, for example. And increasingly, these issues are becoming important, particularly in Europe, but also in the West in general, because things have changed. There's mass immigration to Europe, and so on and so forth. And naturally, people are going to react. And they're going to react tribally. I might not be a tribalist myself, but most people are. Now, one of the reasons why it seems, in the perception of many, that I skew towards the right, even though I wouldn't consider myself to be on the right, is because, above all, I dislike and can't stand intellectual inconsistency and intellectual contradiction. And it just so happens that most of the intellectual inconsistency and intellectual contradiction is to be found on the left, particularly these days. Notions of egalitarianism, of the ability to create a fair world, of everyone being the same. These are all ideas that have been, unfortunately, carried out from the left, born of the left, primarily. And I simply cannot find any accordance with that because it doesn't map onto reality. I'm mostly concerned with reality. I want to understand the world and try to transmit that understanding. So when you have somebody on the left talk about egalitarianism and fairness and all these things that don't really have a real basis in nature and reality, I can't get on board with that. And by and large, not consistently, and I'll point out an inconsistency shortly, people on the right tend to be a little bit less contradictory and a little less inconsistent. Many people on the right subscribe to reality more than many people on the left. So if it seems that I skew towards the right, it's only because of that. I have no allegiance to any political group, no ethnic group, no whatever. I just go my own way. I do my own thing. But I cannot stand inconsistency. So the premise of modern egalitarianism is that everybody is the same and everyone can achieve the same. Where do you find that in reality? You don't. And I argue kind of a hard anti-egalitarian, if such a term exists, because I don't even think you can achieve equality before the law, which is what some people who would argue for a type of egalitarianism might do. And you see this with the skewed prison sentences vis-a-vis men versus women. It's simply not achievable. Although I might add that equality before the law might be something worthy of striving for. That is a useful illusion that we might need to maintain for the sake of a coherent society. It doesn't mean it's realistic or it's actually actionable. It just means that it's a useful illusion that we might need to keep up. But all other forms of illusion and pretense must be jettisoned because they don't map onto reality and define reality, I think. As we human beings attempt to defy reality in ways that are just so incongruous with how nature works, sometimes it works, but more often than not, it doesn't. And you end up with the fucked up state of civilization we're in currently, with regard to gender relations and the size of government, relationships, marriage, etc. And also, of course, with regard to other things such as immigration, cultural differences, IQ differences, and so on and so forth. Now, I'm not without criticism for people on the right. Now, Stefan Moyu is not really officially on the right. I think he describes himself as an anarcho-capitalist or an anarchist, or I don't really know. But one of the great inconsistencies I find with him is that, particularly in the past year, he spent a lot of time talking about racial differences, ethnic differences, IQ differences. In fact, he seems very gung-ho on them. And for the most part, I can get on board with that. I think there's evidence to suggest that there are differences in IQ. In fact, it's well documented between people with different ethnic profiles. But why in hell does he maintain this stance on this untenable and nebulous stance on free will? He spends all this time talking about determined causes, IQ being heritable, largely heritable, the importance of environment with his wonky spanking theories, and yet he clings to this tenuous idea of free will. I think he does, and I'm hypothesizing here, I'm just speculating, because he thinks he can't be an anarcho-capitalist without clinging to this silly notion of free will. Now, I'm not an anarcho-capitalist myself, but I do think it is possible to maintain that stance without any sort of notion of an illusion or delusion of free will. Well, once again, he's being inconsistent, to my view of things at least. And if you look at the left, well, it's just filled chock-a-block with contradictions and inconsistencies. Most recently, both C.S. MGTOW and Girl Writes What made videos about this alleged neuroscientist, she's actually a professor of psychology, Dr. Noel, where she's publicly lying, she's contradicting herself in two different sentences within the span of a few minutes. This is what you've come to expect from the left, and so it seems natural that anyone who opposes inconsistency and contradiction is in favor of evidence and truth and understanding information and data is not going to side with the left. Now, Raging Golden Eagle pointed out in a fairly recent video a while back, and it was an excellent point, that certain things are just a question of a sort of pendulum, which is to say, in the case of, say, free speech, he pointed out, or freedom of expression, that's not necessarily a position the right always has or consistently has had. It's just that, whoever is in the minority tends to be more interested in promoting freedom of expression. And let me tell you, the moment the right starts trying to oppose freedom of expression and freedom of speech, I will call them out on that as well. I'm not on the right, I'm not on the left, I'm only on my own side. I'm interested not in groupthink, but in the individual's path. And this has earned me scorn and disfavor, particularly from MGTOW-minded men, because I won't simply agree with a man or support a man merely because we share genitalia. If his position is shit, and I won't support him. It's pretty simple. I'm not going to agree with men merely because they're men. I'm not going to agree with white Europeans merely because I'm a white European or anything like that. How silly does this sound? I meet someone who happens to be of Hungarian background as well, and I just decide to support all of his positions merely because he's a Hungarian. It's just silly. It doesn't make any sense, to my mind. But I do recognize that most people are tribal, and they maintain their tribal identities throughout their lives. I, as an individual, a non-tribalist, have to live in that constellation where most people are tribal, and I have to navigate it. Now, in navigating that constellation, that labyrinth of tribalism, what side, and if you have to pick a side, are you necessarily going to have to choose if you're in a certain position. Now, am I going to choose the side of Islam, for example, the tribe of Islam? I don't oppose Islam because it oppresses. I don't give a shit about women. For example, I don't oppose Islam because it oppresses women. I oppose Islam because it's repugnant to the individual's rights, because I can't do what I want to do under Islam. And more importantly, I think it's opposed to evolutionary science, which is the basis of understanding just about everything there is when it comes to human beings. So naturally, I will ally with people who are opposed to Islam, because Islam does not represent my interests. And the most important aspect of Islam that I find repugnant is it doesn't leave you alone. It cannot leave you alone. Islam must be spread. There must be indoctrination, and that's why I just don't want it. I don't care how many women are oppressed under Islam. It doesn't interest me. What interests me is my position as an individual with respects to Islam, and in particular, my intellectual opposition. I mean, it's like so many religions, it's chock full of contradictions, and it's just a bunch of bullshit. As I pointed out in the Contented Irrationalist, most people set out with a particular dogma or set of dogmas or an ideology, and then they try to frame the world around that. That's not what I'm trying to do, and perhaps I fall victim to that occasionally, but I strive and I attempt to do my best to not go that way, down that route. So we need to be, as individuals, open to new evidence. And in this particular case, I think people who advocate for, say, white nationalism have certain points that are valid in light of what we see. There are obviously ethnic differences between people, and it's just intellectually dishonest to ignore that. It's also intellectually dishonest to not entertain at least the possibility that might have some outcome on society and culture. Now, the degree to which this is all environmental versus inherent, I think, is always it's a complex interplay, and the ultimate percentages there are indeterminable. But we cannot ignore that if we want to be intellectually honest about these things. The state of societies, how civilizations develop, there are all kinds of ideas, but I think all of them would ultimately need to embrace some elements of environmentalism and some elements of a predetermined or inherent biological faculty. But what I don't like is just inconsistency. And by and large, at this current juncture in time, rather, perhaps better said, people on the right tend to be a bit more consistent than people on the left. And so I skew towards that more. If for whatever reason, in the course of my lifetime, people on the right started to be a muck of inherent contradictions and inconsistencies, and many of them are, but say more so than people on the left, I guess I would skew left. But as for me, I'm not concerned with any of these groups. I just dislike inconsistency and contradiction. And I have to live in a world where people are tribal, even though I myself don't feel that. Why that's the case? Well, who knows? As the fantasy figure, the architect in the Dragon Age Origins DLC, the Awakening mentioned, he's asked, he's alone amongst the Darkspawn. He has this faculty of speech and this ability to think for himself. Why he ended up that way, well, I don't know. I grew up feeling not a shred, a bone of tribalism or ethnic identity. I just don't care about that stuff. But I know that other people do, so I have to pay attention to it. I have to pay attention to it particularly because I live in Europe where tribal and ethnic identity is becoming increasingly important to most people. You know? And I have to pay attention to the reality of what we can document about human beings. So wherefore I speak for no one but myself, but I still have to be a pragmatist. Above all, in this world that we all live in, those of us who aren't tribalists have to be pragmatists. And we also have to point out inconsistencies. So a temporary ally, and I view all of these people as temporary allies, is really anyone who is grounded in reality and willing to entertain reality, even though they might be dogmatically and ideologically driven. I'm not going to deny that. I mean, so for example, people on the alt-right, which is, of course, not a monolith and not uniform, some of their views are distasteful to certain people. Some of their views are distasteful to me being an individual, and that's just not caring about things like that. But they're also right on a lot of things. I would say, depending on the person, more right than most people on the left. And I will ally, at least temporarily, with anyone who is willing to promote reality and an understanding of reality, even if they're dogmatically or ideologically driven. You can't live in a world completely shut off from the realities of what it means to be a human being. To most human beings, being tribal is part of being a human being. It's when I lived in South Korea, not being Asian to my knowledge at least, or particularly Korean, I was an oddity. The bald guy. I mean, Koreans would walk up to me and rub my head because they'd never seen that before. They'd never seen arm hair before, what they call 털, body hair. So this was, I don't blame them for it. They just didn't know it. They're just tribal. That's just the way they are. And I think that's how people are. So even if you're not a tribalist yourself, you have to live in this reality. But I don't really care for this ethnic tribal stuff. I don't care for white nationalism. I don't care for Jewish nationalism. I don't care for black nationalism, Asian. All that shit is pretty repugnant to me personally. But, and what's funny is that all these nationalist groups who tend to oppose each other, Jewish nationalists oppose white nationalists, vice versa. Black nationalists oppose white and vice versa. It really depends on the con. Some people say they don't oppose each other, but if you observe, most of them do. They have a lot more in common than they are willing to give credit for. But I don't like any of that. But that's the reality we live in, unfortunately. So, what are you going to do? I have to be pragmatic about these things. And so I'm not going to ally with someone who believes in the doctrine of egalitarianism. That's just wrong. There's no basis for that. There's no basis for real equality, or not even equality before the law. But so if I'm asked, wherefore I speak for myself as an individual. I speak for trying to understand the world and trying to transmit that understanding. I do not commit myself to groups merely because the group has some superficial similarity with me. That's just how I roll, how I go my own way. So, for those of you who are relatively new to the channel, and for those of you who are of the old guard, old subs, who don't refer to me as Thinking-Ape but Stardust, I don't mind either. That is how I roll. It's not because me talking about other issues apart from gender identity or sex differences, which I still do, mind you. That's just because we live in this current reality, and the current trend demands that we at least assign some interest and attention to issues of nationality and race and ethnicity, because that's just the way things are going right now. Anyway, thought I point that out in my positions on various things there. Hope you have a pleasant remaining week, and I will see you soon. Bye-bye.